if my boss just doesn't listen to me? Hey folks, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and a couple of weeks ago, one of my friends said, you really ought to do a video on what to do if your boss just isn't listening to your findings or reality. And believe it or not, most of what I've presented over the last 2 weeks has really been geared towards answering that question, because by the time you get to the desk side brief with your boss and he's not paying attention, there's a lot of things that could have gone wrong. But first, a snarky joke. There's this major, and he says to the major working beside him, "I got a personality conflict with my boss." And his buddy turns to him and says, "Oh no, your boss has the personality. You have the conflict." And in a lot of cases, the same thing applies when an executive isn't really listening to an action officer. A lot of times it's because the action officer hasn't been listening to the executive. I've talked before about how executives have this very specific set of decisions they have to make. If an executive isn't listening to a briefing from one of his action officers, one reason could be that it's not answering the questions he needs answered to make decisions. One way an action officer can avoid this is by understanding the priorities of his executive. At the same time, the action officer's information might be late to need. Maybe the decision was already made, and the executive is just being polite about taking the brief. After all, the action officer did do a lot of work. The way to address this is with short, frequent progress updates to the executive. That way, the executive has the most current information possible if he has to make a decision. If the question starts to change, the executive can give guidance to shape the work of the action officer. And if the executive doesn't need the work anymore, he can simply tell the action officer to move on to something that's a higher priority. Another way that action officers can lose the ear of their executive is by ignoring either people or facts that the executive is not going to ignore. And this can be particularly tricky if either you're a new action officer or your executive is a new executive and you just don't know what he listens to or trusts. That's why it's always a good idea to figure out who the executive trusts and bounce your work off of them.
Don't you think you're getting a little preachy?
I'm trying not to. Okay, look, maybe your boss is the source of the problem. These next couple of techniques are dangerous because they can blow up in your face and damage your credibility. So it pays to take a little bit of time, cross your I's, dot your T's, and make sure that you're not the source of the problem. First, some executives surround themselves with a group of trusted people, and believe it or not, you can leverage this in a couple of ways. First, identify who those people are and bounce your material off of them. They will help shape it in order to make sure it answers the boss's questions and it's received in a way that's easily consumable by your boss. Second, when it comes time to present your material, you always want one of those circle of trust people in the room with you, even if they're just sitting on the couch. Don't be surprised if at some point in your brief, the executive turns to this trusted person and starts to have a conversation that at first glance doesn't seem to be about the topic you're presenting on. This is a good sign. It means that you are providing useful information, and when this happens, listen to what's really going on inside the executive's head. Okay, before I wrap up, I'm going to give you one incredibly dangerous technique. If you do this wrong, it can permanently taint your reputation. So I would reserve this for issues of major national interest. If your executive won't listen, what you do is you take your findings to an executive who will listen. Now, obviously, if your executive finds out that you're doing this, you can end up in a lot of hot water. So if you're going to do this, it's best to let it develop organically. Present the information at a low level. Let the other executive's staff ask for information on it. Do not push the information and do not aggressively seek a meeting with the other executive. And when you finally do get that meeting with the executive outside your organization, come back to your executive and ask how they want you to engage in what guidance they have. Ultimately, executives are involved in this complex, multi-layered decision-making process. And so our job is less about convincing them to see the world the way we do, and more about providing them the information and tools that's necessary for them to be able to successfully make these decisions. And earlier I said that this video was based off of a question that I got from somebody who wanted me to address this. So if you have questions that you want me to address, it's as easy as leaving a question in the comments, and trust me, I will get to them as quickly as I can. In the meantime, take care of each other, do a good job, and we will see you out there.